the polar ice caps and the rising sea levels, the acidification of the oceans, the dying or extraction of the rainforests, the over polluting various parts of the earth, etc., etc. All of these present on our current course long-term threats to our existence as a nation and as a species. And Dr. Logan's point was, well, in the past when we have perceived a serious threat to our long-term health and well-being, we've reacted. Why aren't we reacting now? What's going on that we aren't being as proactive about these Sputniks as we were the original Sputnik? I have no doubt in my mind that part of the answer going forward will be science and technology. I'm grateful for every advance of science. I'm grateful for just about every new technology that has been developed. And I have no doubt at all that science and technology, if the human race manages to reverse our course and save ourselves, that science and technology will play a key role in that. But I think we have another problem. And the other problem has to do with a kind of religious assumption that is, I think, ubiquitous throughout the Western civilized world. And that religious assumption is that we can remain passive, and that is, we don't have to worry about working on us, changing ourselves, changing the way we think. We can passively stand by and wait for science and technology, and or science and technology with the free market to save our bacon over the long term. That just the natural operations of the development of science, the natural invisible hand of the market will work together, and we will eventually save ourselves and the planet. We don't have to change our thinking. I think that is a dangerous religious assumption. And it's dangerous because it fails to recognize that science and technology came out of our minds, out of our brains. And not only the development of science and technology, but how and where and when it will be used also will come out of our brains. In other words, the way we think about the world has everything to do with our use of science and technology. Science and technology are simply tools of our own minds. And so what is in our minds, the attitudes that we hold, those are fundamental. They're more fundamental than the tools that we use. So we might ask the question, well, how do we need to modify our ways of thinking? If a change is called for, what would that change look like? How should we be thinking about science and technology? Well, I think here we can draw on the basic insight of Trinitarian theology. This basic insight that says that whatever the sacred is, it has something to do with community. That one way to understand what it means to be sacred, one definition of sacredness itself is relational. It involves relating to, being in community with, maintaining community with others. That means that as we re-examine our thinking, we need to re-examine our attitudes about not only ourselves, what it means to be a human being, but also our attitudes about our way of thinking. And thinking becomes habitual, so you really do have to pay attention to how you think, otherwise you just automatically roll along. But as we pay attention, we need to pay attention to how we think about not only ourselves, but also the neighbor who lives next door to us. How do we think about that person? How do we think about the neighbor down the street from us? Maybe we've met them, maybe we haven't. How do we think about our neighbors on the other side of the globe? And how do we think about this beautiful round ball that all 7.5 billion of us call home? What is our relationship to our mother, the earth? We live in a culture that has lifted up the individual. And I celebrate individualism. I think individualism has birthed an attitude of liberty and freedom in ways that other cultures and other places throughout history couldn't even dream about. However, our focus on individualism has led us to formulate an economic system that perpetuates itself, that lives and breathes, if you will, based upon consumption. To put another way, the dominant cultural message is that your reason for being is to consume whatever it is that you want, or at least to work like the Dickens at getting it. And so we have created a massive cultural machine that does nothing but create desires and then try to fulfill them by providing products to fulfill those desires. And then when those desires are filled, other new desires are created. And additional desires beyond that, and additional wants beyond that, so that the assumption is that of infinite, unlimited, limitless consumption. We always have to want more. That's how the whole thing is predicated. That's the whole basis of the system. And that basis has become a religious dogma. You might want to get that. That might be God. She always has something to say about my sermon. What was I talking about? So this individualism that is in some way been the source of so much of our material blessing, right, has a dark side to it. And that is that it may lead us, I think it has led us for the most part, to underestimate, if I guess is a good word, or maybe not pay enough attention to the other reality about our existence, and that is not only are we individuals with individual wants and needs and dreams and hopes, we are also interdependent with other living beings. And that's the part that gets downplayed in our individualistic culture. We forget, or we don't pay enough attention to the fact that we live and move and have our being in community. That we live on the health and well-being of community. That our health and well-being is wholly dependent upon the health and well-being of the larger community, the larger context in which we live. And that if we pay attention only to what we want and only to what we think we need, and we forget our deep dependency and connection with all other living beings, then we may act to undermine their health and well-being, and eventually that will catch up with us. And I think that's what we're seeing on a global scale now. We're seeing that begin to catch up with us. So the call, I think, of the idea of Trinity, the idea of the sacred in community, is for us to thicken, not eliminate the value of individualism, but to somehow restore balance between our individualism and our interdependency with all other living beings. And you know what I'm talking about, right? When I say interdependence, I mean, there are a cajillion examples of them, right? One that just pops into mind are whales. Whales, the largest mammals on Earth, depend upon some of the tiniest organisms on Earth. And if you undermine those tiny organisms, the acidification of the ocean, it's starting to kill off the plankton that the whales survive on, you see? And we could go on and on. One author talked about the bread maker. You know, the bread maker makes bread because the policeman can't, doesn't have time, right? So the policeman instead walks the beat and protects the community. How? So that the waitress can wait tables and provide food for the customers. And one of those customers is the home builder who builds homes for the families, and the families consume the bread. And so there's a million sort of permutations on that theme. We are interconnected, socially, economically, but also biologically, spiritually, in every other way. And the well-being of one another has everything to do with our individual well-being. And somehow or another, part of the change of thinking that has got to happen going forward into time is we have to restore a balance between our individualism and our interdependency. I want to close out by talking about the research that has been conducted over these many years by Dr. James Fowler. I talked to you about this a year or two ago. In fact, we spent several Sundays looking at his theory of stages of faith. You remember we talked about Dr. Fowler identifying 6 different stages that people go through in their faith development, or that some people go through in their faith development. Well, I obviously don't have time. I have time, but you wouldn't stay to go through all 6 of those stages. So I'm just going to talk about early and late in very general terms, okay? So Dr. Fowler noticed when he studied faith development that you could call early stage faith development as being characterized in the following way. I derive my identity through my belonging to a group of people who look like me, talk like me, sound like me, and hold to a very specific ideological position. So my idea of community, therefore, is pretty narrow. My community is pretty small. They're people who look and sound and think pretty much like I do, believe like I do, hold the same ideas that I do, and therefore the people out here who are not like us, they don't look like us, they don't sound like us, those people are not part of the community. In fact, in some cases, they are seen as a threat, or at least a source of anxiety or a source of misunderstanding, if not a threat. Okay? So this is faith as, and this is, within this idea is God is our God. We own the truth, and the truth is what we say it is. It's our tradition. Everybody else is outside of God's favor, of truth, etc. Now, in general terms, late stage faith stands in contrast to that. Late stage faith is able to embrace the tradition that you were raised in. It's not about jettisoning your tradition, rejecting the tradition in which you were raised, and going off and becoming something else. It's not about me, having been raised as a Christian, going off and becoming a Buddhist necessarily. But what happens is in between my ears and in my heart. What happens in late stage faith is my notion of community gets much, much, much bigger. And I can embrace the wisdom, the insights, the truthfulness of my own tradition without rejecting or closing myself off to the truth, the insights, the wisdoms of other people's traditions. Right? I just refuse to accept it's either or. My mind, my thinking shifts more toward both and. And I begin to see that diversity is an enriching thing in my life. That the more I'm exposed to, the more I learn from people who are different than myself, the more my life is enriched. So my community, my idea of community goes from being the size of a postage stamp to moving toward universality. And you see universality in all the great prophets and the great mystics. You see it in the prophets of Israel. You see it in Pauline writing. You get hints of it in some of the teachings of Jesus. You see it in the teaching of Buddha, of Gandhi. On and on we go. It seems like those who reach the highest pinnacles of spirituality are the most inclusive. They get it. They understand that the person on the other side of the globe with different skin color, different language, different religious language is as much a member of my family as the person living in the house with me. That we are all brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters in Christ, in the sacred, in holy community. So I close with this simple thought. I wonder if part of our witness to the world can't be to go out into the community and in the name of the Trinity, the three in one, the sacred community, invite people to expand their notion of community. So that rather than working against each other, we can work together with those who are different than ourselves, so that all of us, those who look and sound like us, and those on the other side of the planet who may be completely different, so that all of us, all of humanity, may find not only that community is sacred, but that we have to have one another in order to make it into the future. I'm worried about my grandkids and my great-grandkids. I want you to worry about them too, and I want you to let that motivate us to expand our definition of who's in our family. In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen.